I welcome you to the second of the 2014 J.K. Zeman Lectures at Acadia University, sponsored by the Acadia Centre for Baptist and Anabaptist Studies. Just by way of note, the ACBAS, or Acadia Centre for Baptist and Anabaptist Studies, is a joint center of excellence co-sponsored by Acadia Divinity College and the Vaughn Library of Acadia University. The second lecture, which we are about to join, was held in the quiet reading room of the Vaughn Library, in which Dr. Stayer continues his theme of Anabaptist history and development in the focal life of the Hutterite community in the 16th and 17th centuries. Welcome.
Now, what we did last night was to look at the way in which Jarold Zeman ripped up the previous paradigm of Anabaptist history in Moravia, which was Hutterocentric. It was centered on the Hutterites. He is responsible more than any other figure in changing this and making it evident to the people who were studying Moravian Anabaptism that Moravian Anabaptism was not just the story of the Hutterites, and certainly not the story of the Hutterites as they told it about themselves in their chronicle, but that it was the story of a group of Anabaptist communities that differed in significant ways from each other and contributed a good deal to the history of Moravian Anabaptism as one of the two major places in which Anabaptism was able to survive in the 16th century. One can argue whether the Netherlands or Moravia was the more important. They had a common denominator. In both places, the Anabaptists had protectors, well-willing protectors. The rulers of the Dutch Republic and the Moravian aristocracy, which had a lot of power in the Moravian constitution, protected the Anabaptists and enabled Anabaptism to flourish in the 16th century and to survive into a future period. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do is to detour from Dr. Zeman's paradigm shift to talk about my own contribution to Moravian Anabaptism, which he rightly deplored as excessively Hutterite-centered. I've just told you that centering Moravian Anabaptism on the Hutterites was what he turned us away from. In my own book, The German Peasants' War and Anabaptist Community of Goods, published in 1991, I tried to discover the roots of the enormously successful Hutterite communal life in the ideals of early Anabaptism. I found that these factors that led to communalism in Anabaptism go back to the very beginning of the movement, to the very first instructions that Felix Manz gave to his converts on the 22nd of January, the day after the first Anabaptist baptisms in Zurich. He told them, according to the source, about love and unity and the community of all things as in Acts 2. A Swiss congregational ordinance that circulated early in the life of the movement at the latest in 1527, forbade Anabaptists to have anything of their own and commanded them to establish a common store for needy congregants. In practice, this amounted to a prescription based on Acts 2 and 4 of a voluntary sharing between prosperous and needy Anabaptists. Anabaptists in the tradition of Thomas Müntzer and Hans Hut also stressed sharing between congregants. But in that tradition, they held expectations of a more perfect community of goods connected with the apocalyptic future after the return of Jesus Christ. According to the classic description in the Hutterite Chronicle, the 200 Anabaptists who left Nikolsburg in March 1528, you should be reminded that Hans Hut expected Jesus Christ to return to earth in June 1528. These people attained a further stage of community of goods which combined the piety of Hans Hut with the Swiss Congregational Ordinance to which I've referred. Again, the appeal was to Acts 2 and 4. The needy must be supported in accordance with the teaching of the prophets and apostles, said the Hutterite Chronicle. Now, Jarold Zeman correctly observed that this small group setting out from Nikolsburg in Moravia to Austerlitz were considered by the Hutterite chronicler to be Proto-Hutterites, ancestors of the Hutterites. Are we to regard the chronicle as historically correct on this point? This requires a yes and no answer, a nuanced answer. Yes, in the sense that the Hutterites were beholden to a general early Anabaptist ideal of resurrecting the Church of the Apostles as it had existed in Jerusalem immediately after the day of Pentecost. No, however, in the sense that no one at the time foresaw the extensive Hutterite communal settlements, the Haushaben, of the later 16th century. The early Anabaptist ideal based on Acts 2 and 4 did not uproot the economics of individual family-centered households or create total equality among the Anabaptist congregants. In fact, complaints about pervasive inequality between families and corruption among Anabaptist leaders at Austerlitz and Auspitz make up much of the Hutterite Chronicle's justification of Jacob Hutter's arrival from the Tyrol to take charge of things in 1533. Now that is my modest contribution to this subject. A much bigger contribution than mine came from my student, early career PhD student, Werner Packel. Werner's book, Hutterite Beginnings, Communitarian Experiments During the Reformation, which was published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 1995. This book is the only North American contribution to the history of Moravian Anabaptism, or for that matter, the only North American contribution to the history of Anabaptism that has been considered to be important enough to need translating into German. And it was. Packel first pointed to 1535 as a very important transition in Anabaptism between the early ideal of reconstructing the Apostolic Church as it had existed in Jerusalem just after Pentecost, and the later acceptance by all non-Hutterite Anabaptists that the Jerusalem congregation was not a norm, but simply a transitory stage in the history of New Testament Christianity. This fateful turn was undoubtedly heavily influenced by the notoriety of the Anabaptist regime in Munster and Westphalia, which held power from February 1534 to June 1535. This Anabaptist regime practiced a form of community of goods while it was under military siege, and it tended to discredit community of goods among Anabaptists and among the people who observed them in the time of the Reformation. Packel's book also marks the beginning of an important self-correction in the historiography of Anabaptism. Some of our colleagues said you can't correct yourselves because if you say that you've made a mistake, well, then what authority do you have left? But Werner and I didn't quite like that way of doing history. In 1975, Werner Packel, Klaus Depperman, and I published an article in the Mennonite Quarterly Review entitled From Monogenesis to Polygenesis, the historical discussion of Anabaptist origins. We argued that there was not one beginning of Anabaptism, but three distinct beginnings of Anabaptism. And Werner Packel continued to make that argument in the publication of his thesis 2 years later, in 1977. But now Werner found evidence in the study of Moravian Anabaptism that corrected the earlier point of view that we had had. This early Swiss congregational ordinance that I mentioned as establishing community of goods in 1527 or earlier had an echo in a discipline that was found in the Hutterite Chronicle, and also in a document called the Common Order of the Members of Christ, set in 7 articles, which circulated among the followers of Pilgrim Marbeck. The last of these documents had a lot to say about the organization of Anabaptist congregations, but it explicitly abandoned the earlier Anabaptist ideal of recreating the Jerusalem church. And therefore, this document would have to be dated from after 1535, probably about 1540. But Werner found that the study of, from his study of these 3 organizational documents, that there were numerous textual connections between them. They borrowed from each other, and this convinced him that there were ties between Swiss and South German Austrian Anabaptism, and both with Moravian Anabaptism, that were closer than we had previously argued. In part, now I want to show you the part of Werner Packel's book that builds on the beginnings that Jarold Zeman laid for the study of Moravian Anabaptism. In part 1 of his book, The First Communitarian Experiments, Packel continued and enlarged Zeman's emphasis on the non-Hutterite communities in Moravia. At the same time, he worked out a more nuanced presentation of early Anabaptism generally. He stressed that Moravia, for better or worse, introduced micro-denominationalism into Anabaptism. The Moravian Anabaptists first broke up into separate groups which were loudly intolerant of each other. Early Anabaptism in the 5 years of the end of the 20s had contained many differences of opinion, but Werner showed that it did not have clearly defined groups that were denouncing each other. He illustrates this particularly in paying attention to the Anabaptists who were assembling in the imperial city of Strasbourg in the late 1520s. Figures like Wilhelm Reublin, one of the first Swiss baptizers, Jakob Kautz, and Melchior Hoffmann, who went on to be the creator of North German Netherlands Anabaptism, these people differed with each other on many important points, but they still regarded each other as brothers. These years, 1528 and 1529, were years of terrible persecution of all Anabaptists. They were the height of the persecution of the Anabaptists in the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. This persecution was driven above all by Roman Catholics, but it was endorsed by the reformers of Wittenberg and Zurich as well. Strasbourg and Moravia were islands of relative safety for Anabaptists, and despite individual religious differences, these Anabaptists in Strasbourg, before the 1530s, recognized that what united them was more important than what divided them. This was an important correction of some of the earlier over-eager looking for group distinctions that we revisionists had been engaged in at that time. Against this background, Packel gave us the first significant history of the Philippites and the Gabrielites, the two Anabaptist groups that flourished in Moravia between 1528 and the renewed sharp persecutions of Anabaptism in Moravia that set in reaction, partly in reaction to Münster in 1535 and 1536. Philip Planer, a weaver, came from a community near Strasbourg. He gathered followers from Swabia, the Rhineland, and the Palatinate, all areas in West Germany. Packel describes this group's teaching and practices as a diluted form of Swiss-type Anabaptism. Not tightly organized according to the principles of the 7 Articles of Schleitheim, which were supposed to be the organizing principle of Swiss Anabaptism. But he goes on, no evidence exists to suggest that Philip advocated a unique or different form of Anabaptism, generically at variance with Swiss Anabaptism. When Philip and his followers first arrived in Moravia in 1528, they joined the followers of Gabriel Ascherham, who were already settled at a place called Rossitz. Gabriel Ascherham at first assigned Philip Planer the leadership of the united community, but differences developed between the followers of Philip Planer and the followers of Gabriel Ascherham. So what did they do? They separated in a friendly way into 2 communities. The Philippites settled at a place called Auspitz, while the Gabrielites remained at Rossitz. By the time of the 1535 expulsion of many Anabaptists from Moravia, the Philippite community had grown to about 400 adults as newcomers arrived from West Germany. The major historic legacy of the Philippites was a part of their expulsion from Moravia in 1535 and 1536. 50 of them, returning to their West German homeland, were imprisoned in Passau in Austria. They are said to be the source of the first Anabaptist hymn book that was published eventually in 1564. These hymns were used both by the Swiss Brethren and by the Hutterites. When first published, the hymns were attributed to Swiss Brethren. Packel shows that they came from the Philippites. But the Philippites were more or less Swiss Brethren when they came to Moravia, and they were absorbed into the Swiss Brethren after they returned to their homeland. Curiously, two of the original hymns of the Philippites praised community of goods. They were deleted from the Ostbund, the official Swiss Brethren hymnal, when it was later published toward the end of the 16th century. Packel's research on the Gabrielites, the followers of Gabriel Ascherham, a well-educated furrier from Nuremberg, is still more substantial. Gabriel was a very successful Anabaptist missionary to Silesia. He established a community at Rossitz, as I've already mentioned, in 1528 that attracted Anabaptist refugees from Silesia as well as other lands such as Hesse, and which grew to 1,200 adults. From the start, there was a degree of competition between the Anabaptist community headed by Gabriel Ascherham and the one that was established in the same year, 1528, at Austerlitz, the one that had broken away from the Hubmeier congregation in Nikolsburg. Gabriel Ascherham came to be the presiding bishop of three affiliated communities. The two I've mentioned, his at Rossitz, Philip Planer's at Auspitz, and a third, also at Auspitz, that had seceded from the Austerlitz community in 1531. This third community was dominated by Tyroleans, many of them who had been converted in the Tyrol by Jakob Hutter. In 1533, Hutter came to Moravia and, in essence, took power in that community, the community in Auspitz, after which Gabriel Ascherham and Jakob Hutter became bitter rivals. Packel connects several important documents to the history of the Gabrielite community. Most important, a book, Judgment Concerning the Sword, about Anabaptist non-resistance, by a writer named Clemens Adler. Gabriel Ascherham was a spiritualist. He attributed more significance to the spiritual substance of the Lord's Supper and of baptism than to their external rites, to their external realities. In his later years, Gabriel Ascherham went so far as to mute his opposition to infant baptism. The important thing was that you were right in your mind and spirit about it, but if it was a matter of urgency, you could allow infant baptism, taught Gabriel Ascherham. Community of goods for the Moravian Gabrielites was above all voluntary, a matter not of rules but of generosity of spirit. Greater Packel was very impressed by this aspect of early Anabaptism. He argued that the general attitude of Mennonite historians toward spiritualism, which contrasts spiritualism to biblicism, is simply wrong. It distorts the reality of early Anabaptism. The so-called spiritualists were as interested in the Bible as their opponents. The genuine opposition, Werner Packel argued, was not between spiritualism and biblicism, but between spiritualism and legalism. Gabriel Ascherham, in his polemics against Jakob Hutter, portrays Hutter as the ultimate legalist externalist. According to Ascherham, Hutter's version of community of goods was a rule-bound travesty that was completely lacking the Spirit of God. Certainly it is true about Anabaptism, for anyone who knows Anabaptist history, that Anabaptism did contain a tendency towards spiritualism. I can only mention, besides Gabriel Ascherham, such important figures as Hans Denk in the south, or David Joris, Menno Simon's big counterplayer in the north. After the Great Expulsion from Moravia of 1535-1536, most of the Gabrielites returned to Silesia, but others turned up later in Poland or resettled in Moravia. Gabriel, at the end of his life, wrote an anti-Hutterite history of Anabaptism in Moravia before his death in 1545. Haeckel's interest in spiritualism and anti-spiritualism in Moravia drew him to the great discovery of 20th century Anabaptist Mennonite studies, Pilgrim Marpeck. Among the figures who I mentioned last night, Johann Loserth. Johann Loserth, in his early 80s, in 1929, transcribed and edited a controversial book that Pilgrim Marpeck wrote in the 1540s against one of the most prominent spiritualists of the Reformation era, Caspar von Schwenkfeld. Caspar Schwenkfeld, the founder ultimately of the Schwenkfelder denomination. By Haeckel's time, there was extensive scholarly interest in Marpeck's controversial writings in 1531 against two spiritualizing Anabaptists, Johannes Bundeling and Christian Entfelder. All three, Bundeling, Entfelder, and Marpeck, published their works in Strasbourg. But Haeckel pointed out that what was published in Strasbourg was actually a mirror and an echo of what was going on in the world of Moravian Anabaptism. Bundeling and Entfelder had themselves been active in Moravia, and Marpeck himself was identified in the first sources about him as somebody who had been commissioned to baptize by the church in the land of Moravia. That church was clearly the one established at Austerlitz early in 1528. Marpeck had been a Tyrolean patrician when he was converted to Anabaptism in 1528. He upheld the continuance of the external ordinances of the Christian church against the spiritualists who argued that externals had lost their validity with the passing of the generation of the apostles. According to Marpeck's opponents, since Pentecost, the Holy Spirit was the only legitimate directing hand in the church. Haeckel established that by the mid-1530s, Marpeck had abandoned his earlier advocacy of community of goods and had written that the first congregation of the apostles in Jerusalem was only one stage in the life of the New Testament church. Marpeck went on after the mid-1530s to develop the version of Christian theology that in the eyes of contemporary Mennonites best articulates Anabaptist theology. It articulates an orthodox two-natures doctrine about Christ, about Christology. It has a balanced view from the modern Mennonite standpoint about the character of the sacraments, and it properly subordinates the Old Testament to the New Testament. Packel argues convincingly that Marpeck had investigated the schism of 1531 in the Austerlitz community and decided against the Proto-Hutterite schismatics and for the Austerlitz leadership, which was at that time in the hands of Jakob Wiedemann. Packel's mistake was to assume that the persecution of 1535-1536 had comparably disastrous effects on the Philippite, the Gabrielite, and the Austerlitz communities. He was aware that Marpeck maintained some contacts with Moravian Anabaptists throughout his life. In fact, he names Cornelius Fay as Marpeck's contact in Moravia. But at the time of Packel's Hutterite beginnings, the fascination and the scholarship with Pilgrim Marpeck obscured the reality that the Austerlitz Brethren remained an important force in Moravian Anabaptism for a generation after the 1535-1536 persecutions. Pilgrim Marpeck was the Austerlitzer representative in the Western lands, rather than the Austerlitzers being scattered Pilgrimite elements in Moravia. But this was pinned down by the scholarship of Martin Rothkegel. And so you have stage by stage revision and self-revision, correction of the Anabaptist story from one historian to the next. It's absolutely essential that we be capable of admitting that we make mistakes and correct them as we go along. 5 or 6 years after the publication of Werner Packel's book, Martin Rothkegel completed his PhD dissertation at Prague University, The Nikolsburg Reformation, 1526-1535, and pay attention to the subtitle, From Humanism to Sabbatarianism. This dissertation was completed in 2001. In 2001, the Czech Republic was no longer part of the Soviet bloc. Indeed, the USSR no longer existed. And the archives of Eastern Europe were open to Western scholars who had the energy and linguistic skills to use them. Jarold Zeman died in the year 2000. But by that time, the obstacles that impeded his research program had disappeared. In many respects, Martin Rothkegel is Jarold Zeman's successor. He's taken up Jarold Zeman's research agenda. Martin is a German, age 45, was born in Hamburg. He's married to a Slovak. Since the year 2007, he's taught at the Baptist Theological Seminary at Elstau, outside Berlin. He's a member not only of ACBAS, as I've got to get used to saying it, rather than articulating the words, but also the Teuferachten Commission, which has the assignment to assemble and publish Anabaptist sources. Martin has an impressive agenda of source publications before him, which will publish previously unknown Anabaptist documents from Moravia, Silesia, and Italy. Especially Italy is an important breakthrough in widening the scope of Anabaptist studies. The subtitle of Martin Roetkegel's 2001 dissertation, From Humanism to Sabbatarianism, sums up his interpretation of the Nikolsburg Reformation. This Reformation it began with humanism, and it went to Sabbatarianism. It was a Reformation from above that was not created by Balthasar Hubmaier, but as Martin Roetkegel shows, it was a Reformation into which Balthasar Hubmaier was invited in 1526. He was invited to Nikolsburg by a triumvirate of humanists. Their names were Martin Goschel, Oswald Gleit, and Johannes Spittelmeyer. All were positively disposed to the Reformation, although in the pre-Hubmaier years, they were more Erasmian sacramentarian than anything else. They were not Lutherans. Although his superiors were trying to strip him of his powers as a bishop, until 1528, Martin Goschel exercised rights of clerical appointment in Nikolsburg and the parishes around it. With the support of the territorial lord, Leonard of Liechtenstein, Goschel used his powers in Nikolsburg to institute a territorial reformation. He began by appointing Johannes Spittelmeyer in 1524 as the local pastor in Nikolsburg. Spittelmeyer had been a student of Balthasar Hubmaier at the University of Ingolstadt. And so after he established himself as pastor in Nikolsburg, he invited his former professor, who had been chased out of Switzerland by Zwingli in an unedifying way, to join him in Moravia. Goschel and Oswald Gleit were active in 1526 before Hubmaier's arrival. They were trying to achieve a union between reform-minded Utrichists, that is, people in the tradition of Jan Hus, and reform-minded Czech Utrichists and reform-minded German Catholics to establish a Protestant Reformation on Erasmian sacramentarian principles. Then Hubmaier arrived in Nikolsburg, and he won the whole Nikolsburg congregation to believers' baptism, to Anabaptism. This, as it turned out, ended their broader ecumenical prospects, although not their ecumenical ambitions. An important change had occurred in 1526 at the same time that Hubmaier arrived in Moravia. The Turks killed the ruler of Bohemia and Moravia and Hungary in the Battle of Mohacs, and due to a family pact, he was succeeded by the dogmatic Catholic Ferdinand I, brother of Charles V. And this made for big trouble in Moravia. And how it was managed for a generation is one of the things we must look at. The Habsburgs made it impossible for Hubmaier, who had been in trouble with them before he left for Moravia, to reach out successfully to Utrichist and Bohemian brethren of Czech origin. Hubmaier himself didn't stray very far from the common sacramentarian theology that everyone held at Nikolsburg when he came there. He published in Nikolsburg on free will and predestination in terms that were much closer to Erasmus than to Martin Luther. Hubmaier's Anabaptist Reformation in Nikolsburg was much more of a magisterial reformation than what he had previously accomplished further west as pastor of Waldshut from 1523 to 1525. Hubmaier and his followers had grandiose aspirations to replace Wittenberg and Zurich, to make Nikolsburg the normative center of the Protestant Reformation. The Nikolsburg Reformation was led by parish priests who apparently simply accepted believers' baptism and continued to exercise their functions. There was, however, no enforcement of Anabaptist uniformity. People didn't have to accept believers' baptism. Many parishioners remained unbaptized, and the churches seemed to have run themselves rather than becoming a branch of the territorial government in the Lutheran manner. The government of Vienna was able to remove the most prominent leaders of the Nikolsburg Reformation very quickly in 1527 and 1528. Hubmaier was executed in 1528, and Martin Goschel, the bishop who was making the appointments, was imprisoned for life. But the Moravian territorial constitution ultimately vested power not in the king in Vienna, but in the aristocrats. And the aristocrats, for 100 years, had lived according to a tradition by which there was peaceful coexistence among numerous Christian denominations. This was an inheritance of the Hussite rebellions that took place in the early 15th century. And so the Moravian aristocrats, for the time being, protected the Nikolsburg Church, to the extent that until 1535, the Liechtensteins stayed Anabaptist, and Spittelmeyer and Gleit continued to play a prominent role in the Nikolsburg congregation. Here too, the great persecution that was occasioned by Münster and the reaction to it in 1535 and 1536 was devastating. After 1535, the Liechtensteins were no longer able to appoint pastors. The parish churches were simply abandoned. But until the Liechtenstein family sold the Nikolsburg dominion in 1560, the residents of Nikolsburg and the surrounding area were mostly either Anabaptist or unbaptized. This can be documented from Moravian history. Most striking, however, was what happened next in Nikolsburg. The rise of Sabbatarianism. This was after Hubmaier's death. Here the shadowy figure of Oswald Gleit is central. In the controversy between Balthasar Hubmaier and Hans Hut in 1527, Gleit sided with Hut, and he traveled with Hut to nearby Vienna. Gleit was instrumental in converting the central figures of Austrian Anabaptism, Leonard Schemer and Hans Schlaffer. But after an interval, Gleit returned to Nikolsburg, and he joined Andreas Fischer as pastors in the post-Hubmaier Anabaptist Church of Nikolsburg. From 1530 until 1532, the issue in dispute in the Nicholasburg Church was when to observe the Sabbath. And the question was really not what the superiority of the Old Testament over the New Testament, but the real question was whether the Sabbath was observed on Saturdays or Sundays in the New Testament. According to Gleit, the Decalogue, however, continued to have authority in the New Testament church. He insisted that the Sabbath observed on Saturdays was the third ordinance of the New Testament church, beside baptism and the Lord's Supper. Gleit appears to have won the argument in the Nicholasburg church, although it would seem to contradict the principles of voluntarism to enforce Sabbatarianism on all the members of the Nicholasburg church. What happened, we don't know exactly. Anyhow, the Sabbatarians became a prominent part of the religious scene in the Nicholasburg region well into the second half of the 16th century. This is a part of the history of Moravian Anabaptism that has been spelled out by Martin Rothkegel, not exclusively by him, but primarily by him. Secondly, Martin Rothkegel situated Pilgrim Marpeck more successfully in the continuing history of Moravian Anabaptism than any of the historians who had preceded Rothkegel. Werner Packel correctly observed that after 1535, Marpeck no longer insisted, I'm repeating myself here, that the post-Pentecost Church of Jerusalem was normative, nor that it was necessary for good Christians to practice community of goods. Packel was also aware that Marpeck maintained contact with Moravian Anabaptists, whom he called the Brethren of the Covenant. But Packel didn't know who these contacts of Marpeck's were. Now we know, on the basis of new archival discoveries, due to the work of Martin Rothkegel, that the Austerlitz Brethren survived the persecutions of 1535 and 1536 and stayed in Moravia. Besides Austerlitz itself, they had congregations in 3 major Moravian cities, even in Vienna itself, as well as on numerous estates of Moravian aristocrats. They were primarily urban craftsmen who took oaths of citizenship, sometimes held civil offices, tended to be literate and educated. They ran a hospital with baths and owned several houses as communal property. Their most prominent elder was probably Cornelius Fay. Marpeck's work were carefully studied in Moravia well into the later 16th century. Like Sebastian Frank, Marpeck was something of a compiler of earlier writings. The mark of Marpeck's originality was the way he borrowed from other figures in the 16th century Reformation era. He borrowed from Martin Luther. He borrowed from Bernard Rothman, the spokesman of the Münster Anabaptists. And he probably borrowed also from Caspar von Schwenkfeld before the two of them fell out. Marpeck was a resource for what was probably the most sophisticated mini-denomination in 16th century Anabaptism, but he was not a group leader. Moreover, it's probably mistaken to regard Marpeck personally as an outstanding theologian. Rothkegel regards him as a self-educated person, and he reminds us that most of Marpeck's publications were collective enterprises. Marpeck's most prominent co-worker was Leopold Scharnschlager. the Austerlitz Brethren continued a muted, semi-concealed, semi-conformist life in the Moravian cities until the beginning of the 1600s. Nor were the Austerlitz Brethren and the Sabbatarians the only property-holding Anabaptists in Moravia. The group we know least about is the one called Swiss Brethren. One thing we know about them for certain is that, however, is that they disliked the Austerlitz Brethren. They called the Austerlitz Brethren drinkers who lead a proud and worldly life. But above all, Martin Rothkegel has demonstrated from increasing source material that the Hutterite-centered earlier historiography of Moravian Anabaptism was not all wrong by any means. Increasing source material shows something that Jarold Zeman found at the end of his topography could not be denied. Hutterite-centered, Hutterite Anabaptism became eventually by far the most important Anabaptism in Moravia by the second half of the 16th century. Rothkegel was first assigned to do a thesis on Jakob Hutter, and he absolutely refused to do it. He's totally unimpressed by Jakob Hutter. As far as he's concerned, as far as Rothkegel is concerned, Jakob Hutter is a craftsman who developed a knack of speaking biblically, very much in the same way in which Joseph Smith drenched himself in the King James Bible and then went about to write a Bible of his own, which he called the Book of Mormon. But after the death, the martyrdom of Jakob Hutter in 1536, the Hutterites renewed their efforts to imitate the life of the apostles as described in Acts 2 and 4, and they made a community of goods an all-encompassing system of behavior that became so organized and so ramified that it largely eclipsed the early modern family as the center of economic production, which had been the case in previous attempts at Anabaptist communalism. From 1548 to 1600, from 1548 to the end of the century, the Hutterites expanded in number from 1,000 to 20,000, at least. That's the minimum estimate. They didn't want to pay taxes, and so one of their group secrets was how many of them there were. This they did on the basis of extensive missionary recruiting among Anabaptists and secret Anabaptists throughout southern Germany, Switzerland, and northern Italy. The home regions of Melchiorite Anabaptism in North Germany and the Netherlands seem to have been largely outside the scope of the Hutterite missions. The Hutterites developed a communism of production as well as a communism of consumption. They specialized in handicrafts. They achieved a community of interest with their protectors in the Moravian aristocracy, which was in effect a part of early modern mercantile capitalism. But when the traditional aristocratic constitution of Moravia was destroyed by emerging Habsburg absolutism at the beginning of the 30 Years' War, and the Counter-Reformation carried everything before it, the Hutterites were in 1622 driven out of their Moravian home. Before those expulsions in 1622, Moravia was, together with the Netherlands and even more than Switzerland, the most important center of Anabaptist life. It's the contribution of Jarold Zeman in building on his work of Werner Packel and Martin Rothkegel to establish that fact by supplementing the Hutterite sources with source materials from non-Hutterite Anabaptists and the surrounding Moravian world.
I would like to ask our esteemed chair to read a citation which we have unanimously adopted and prepared to recognize the accomplishments of Dr. James Stayer.
ACBAS, or officially the Acadia Centre for Baptist and Anabaptist Studies here at Acadia, hereby recognizes James M. Stayer for an outstanding lifetime achievement in Anabaptist scholarship, witnessed in research, articles, books, addresses, mentoring graduate students, and contributions to the Academy across 5 decades. With gratitude from your peers and associates, given this 13th day of November 2014 at Wolfville, Nova Scotia, and it's signed by Dr. Brackney and myself. So, congratulations.
And before you say anything, I'd like the Vice President Provost, academic of Acadia University, to make some remarks as well. So,
thank you, Bill. I thank everyone for coming out tonight, and those of you who I saw last night as well. I think I'd like to thank Dr. Stayer for 2 evenings of very interesting talks, a lot of information. And I think that I speak not only on behalf of the university, but also our partnership, I think, with the Divinity College. And ACBAS, I think, represents the best of sort of both parts of the campus. So, according to the website, a relationship between the Divinity School and the library. If you look at our membership, I think the History and Classics department, we're taking over. We're about half, which is quite nice. And as I think Bill noted, and I think Jennifer, we don't have experts in Reformation, but we have people like Barry. I think he left. But Barry does sort of maritime Baptist studies. Mike, who's interested in sort of U.S. history and religion in general and the history of ideas. Jennifer does Middle Ages. I do Asia, so I do sort of missionaries in Asia. So all of us are somehow connected. And I think this also shows the connection between the Divinity School and the Faculty of Arts and the library. And I think in some ways your scholarship sort of reflects that, sort of how these different worlds can come together.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful 2 days. It's the kind of thing that one doesn't really expect. You know, as one gets older and older, I go to events with my wife, and I tell her, well, certainly that's the last time I'm going to be commemorated. This is a fine place, a beautiful place. It has all the atmosphere of a small liberal arts college, which is dear to me and which I grew up in when I was a student in my first 4 years at Juniata College. And so I feel very much at home here. I have very much a sense of coming home here. I understand what you do, and I believe in it fully. Thank you.